All right, Kim. Where I would love to start is at Radical Candor, and I'm just curious, like, what when you look back. I mean, the book has been out, I think, for over a decade now.
Not quite.
Uh,
2017, almost.
is it almost okay? Almost a decade. Feels
Yeah,
like a decade. It feels like
it
it's been.
does.
I mean, it
Feels
feels
like
like one of
dog
those.
years. This
Yeah,
like the last 5 years have felt like 20, I
I'm,
think.
I'm rounding up here,
Yeah.
and no, but it does feel like it. I mean, it kind of caught. You think of like viral business books, like
Yes.
it's caught wind, right? And so, I'm just curious. Like it's a big book in the business world, and I'm wondering like how do you view it now, and then like how I'm also curious like how did it impact you personally?
Well, my whole business career was one giant plan to subsidize my novel writing habit, and and so radical candor taking off the way it did. It surprised me because I had written several novels that never even got published, let alone,
Really? Okay.
yeah, yeah. And so I was thrilled. I feel like it brought the things that I loved most together. It brought my career as an operational leader together with my career as a writer. So it's been transformative for me and my career, and I now feel like all day, every day, I do what I want to do, which is an awesome feeling and not one that I had for the first 25 years of my career. So I'm grateful to the universe for radical candor and the success it had. And I think it came like right at a moment when there was increasingly an awareness that authoritarian leadership just doesn't work as well as collaborative leadership, and figuring out how to change our approach to leadership and how to teach people how to be better managers. I think these things were beginning to become more broadly talked about than they had been before. I think in part because the competition for skills in the marketplace uh, has increased. It's hard to hire people right now. There's a shortage of people. There's the supply and demand shifted, and I think that in an environment where people realize that employees join companies and they leave managers, there's a recognition that we better teach managers how to do better. And we better shift our approach to management. Command and control is not going to get, we can't command and control our way to innovation. And so that's all great. Like that all makes me feel very optimistic about the future. And I will say the best thing about radical candor is that it works. And so if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it and it's going to make you better. And indeed, I did get some feedback about radical candor. And that's what really prompted me to write the next book, Radical Respect.
So I'm sure you did a lot of keynotes and whatnot with big
Yes.
companies. Did you ever have like just somebody that came up to you and I'm sure you had many pieces of feedback, but was there one that kind of stands out that was really meaningful that you heard from?
100%. I got a lot of different uh, feedback, a lot of different kinds of feedback on the book. But hands down, the most valuable feedback that I got came when I was at a tech company in San Francisco, as I often am. And I was giving a radical candor talk shortly after the book came out. And the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, a person I like and respect enormously. So I was really excited to go and speak with her and her team. And after I finished giving the presentation, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it is going to help me build the kind of culture that I want, help this team be more innovative. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me as a Black woman to roll it out than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer people even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, they would call her an angry Black woman. And as soon as she said that, I had four realizations at the same time. The first thing that I realized was that I had not been the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be. Because I knew that this happened to her all the time as soon as she said it, but I hadn't noticed it in the time, in the
Mm.
moment. It hadn't even occurred to me the toll that it must take on her to have to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we had ever been in together, even though I knew she had what to be pissed off about at various times. And yet I hadn't been an upstander. In fact, I had been a silent bystander, and that's not how I view myself. So that was important for me to take stock of, and to figure out how I could do better next time. But the second thing that I realized was not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to her in the workplace, I had also been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to me in the workplace. I'd gone through
Mm.
my whole career pretending that a whole bunch of disrespectful attitudes and behaviors were not happening, that were in fact happening to me. Again, kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit that I was pretending, but that's the truth. Uh,
Well, it's that saying that we write the books that we need, right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think, I wanted to think about why I had done that, why I
Mm.
had gone through, sort of la 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 la. And I think part of the reason was that I didn't want to think of myself, and I also didn't want to think of my colleague as victims. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, did I want to think of myself as a culprit. And so this brought me to my
Oh,
third realization, which is that I had been most deeply in denial about the times when I was the one who had the disrespectful attitude or behavior that made it harder for the people around me to get their work done and to enjoy their work and to enjoy each other. And that, I think, is really important. And that third realization is part of, and you'll probably notice if as you read the book, there's a little bit of a inner conflict, because there's part of me that felt like, as a white woman, oops, I don't know why I just got that
it was perfect
vague.
timing. I thought you were going to
Yes,
say something like
yes,
amazing.
yeah, yeah. I,
Fireworks.
I felt like I had an extra responsibility to write
Yeah.
this book. And
Yeah.
at the same time, I felt like I had no right to write this book. But as a person who, how could I ever consider myself an expert on this when I've had so many unfair advantages throughout my life? And so that was another thing that I had to kind of wrestle with as I wrote the book. But the fourth realization that I had, when my colleague gave me this feedback on Radical Candor, was that as a leader, I always imagined that I was creating these BS free zones where everybody could do the best
Mm.
work of their life and enjoy working together. And I realized that by pretending that these kinds of disrespectful attitudes and behaviors were not making themselves manifest on teams that I led, I was failing to do that. And it's funny, it's like one of those realizations you have to have a bunch of times. But that fourth one maybe was the hardest, and that's why I began with the chapter on what leaders can do about disrespectful attitudes and behaviors. But I remember before I joined Google, I had done a startup. And part of the reason why I started that, I mean, mostly I started the company because I thought it was a great idea and we were going to, make billions of dollars, which we did not. But I also started that company because I wanted to create a better work environment for women. And I thought, well, if I'm in charge, none of this BS will happen. But of course it did happen. And that was the failure of that startup that sort of upset me the most, even more than not being a commercial success. And when I joined Google, I realized it was like the resurrection of a dream, because they had created, I mean, it wasn't perfect. And Google, the bigger it gets, the less perfect it is. But they had created the kind, at least a glimmer of the kind of work environment that I had been trying to create with the startup. And so all of that sort of, that's a big drink of water after a little bit of feedback, but it was what prompted me to sit down and to write Radical Respect.
What do you think happened was that that company that you had founded in 2000, timeline
Yes.
wise?
Yes.
Why did you feel that way about maybe it not panning out the way you had hoped?
In terms of culture.
Yeah.
So there were a number of things that happened at that company but net fast forward to a bunch of mistakes, and I'll go back and sort of categorize those. But there was a moment where a woman who worked at the company came to me and said, I feel like this is a hostile work environment. And to me, this was such an anathema because how had I gotten to a place where someone at the company, and part of my reason for starting the company was to create a great working environment for everyone, in particular women. How had this stuff happened, despite the fact that I was the CEO? And I think that was an important realization because she was correct. There were things that happened at the company that had made it hostile for her. And it took me probably writing this book to be able to sit down and say that. I didn't respond to her. I wish I had, but I didn't respond to her. Oh my gosh, how can I make it better? Which is what I should have responded with. But I think this is not an unusual situation for a manager to be in, for a leader to be in, even for a CEO to be in, where you sort of imagine that you want a great working environment. You didn't intend to create a hostile work environment. And it's so hard to come to grips with the possibility that that might have happened despite your best intentions. And that is part of the reason. And I felt like it was maybe safer for me to admit that I had done that than it would have been at that moment for a white guy, for example, to say, "Oh yeah, I created a hostile work environment for women." And that was like part of why I felt like it was important for me to write the book
Hmm.
that I wrote.
Okay. I love hearing that. I think it's also easy to say, like, maybe that's just an isolated incident, right? And then like move on to the next
Yeah, and that was
problem.
probably kind of what
Yeah.
I did at the time. But the thing that I learned at Google, and I learned this from Shona Brown at Google, who led business operations at Google and who built a lot of the management systems that I think helped create a better culture at Google than any that I had ever experienced at any other company. And what Shona did was she very systematically took away unilateral decision making power from managers. And so if you were a manager at Google, you couldn't hire whoever you wanted, you couldn't fire whoever you wanted, you couldn't give whatever bonus you wanted, you couldn't promote whoever you wanted. And also, if you were a manager at Google and your employees did not like working for you, they could go find themselves another manager and just leave your team,
Mhm.
without even discussing it with you or with HR or anybody else.
What did
And
you think
that
of that? Like, do you think that was the right thing, or is
it
it?
was 100% the right thing, but I will also admit it was 100% very hard for me because shortly after I had inherited 5 people when I first took the job at Google, and in 1 week, 3 of the 5 of them left for other teams. And I remember driving out to the coast and thinking, "Oh my gosh, I'm going to get fired." And it was very at first it was discouraging, but luckily I got support from my manager, and she explained to me what I had done wrong. I had tried to tell people what to do. I had not optimized for collaboration. I was like, I know what to do. And in fact, I was right. I did know what to do. But it didn't matter that I was right. I had to create a process where I was listening to the team, I was helping them clarify their thinking, I was putting ideas up for debate, and then I was pushing other people to make decisions. I was not grabbing the decisions too quickly. And then I was taking the time to persuade the team that the decisions we had made together were the right ones. And only then can you start implementing the decisions. And I jumped too fast to implementation. And I think that's the kind of mistake that a lot of leaders make. I mean, there's another story in Radical Respect about pay at Salesforce. And when Layla Sakes, I hope I'm saying her name correctly, went to Mark Benioff and said to him that women were systemically underpaid at Salesforce, Mark couldn't believe it because it was so. He thought he had created this company where compensation reflected performance, and Layla said to him, "I'm going to show you the data. I'm going to get the data, but you have to promise me before I go and gather the data that if the data proves me correct, that you'll fix the problem. The worst thing we can do is identify the problem and then not fix it. And to his credit, he did say he would fix it. And when he saw the data, it something needed fixing, and it wasn't a one-time fix. They had to design their pay systems very consciously to pay fairly. Otherwise, they were going to reflect and reinforce the pay discrimination in the market more broadly. And also probably some unconscious bias was going to creep into performance reviews and also impact people's pay. And you wind up with unconscious discrimination, but you're not off the hook for
Yeah.
unconscious, it's your job as a leader to be aware of it and to prevent it from happening, to build systems that do prevent that kind of behavior.
That, I mean, that, that could be a separate book by itself. I feel like could be addressed in so many ways, especially with the gender gap, the now with like a remote world, you pay on like experience or geography and all those things.
Yeah,
There's a
yeah.
lot to get right.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is.
You mentioned Shona, and then I was thinking about kind of the words that you mentioned in acknowledgments about her and Jared Smith from Qualtrics, and um, your goal being that you wanted to make sure this book was actionable for leaders, and that they gave you a lot of
Yeah.
good feedback. I'm wondering, like, how do you think those two leaders maybe impacted the book or the rewrite and the edits? Like when you think of Shona and Jared, what comes to
Oh,
mind?
enormously. I mean, the I sort of experienced the systems at Google, but I didn't have the opportunity when I was working there to talk to Shona about. I didn't know how conscious it was. And so when I had the opportunity to talk with Shona and she read the whole book and gave me specific what was going on in her mind and why they did these things. It was very enlightening. I mean, I think I don't know if you remember, but early on at Google, they experimented with just before Shona got there, they experimented with just eliminating management, and it turns out people actually want managers, but they want good managers, not bad managers. uh, and because we long for guidance, we need people. We need to learn from other people. We can't. Most people cannot learn without being taught by another human being, and I think that's part of what managers do. We want to grow in our career, and we need advice about how we can grow in our career. We need feedback. We need developmental feedback that's going to help us grow.
Can I can
And
I can I ask you a quick question?
yeah,
How many good managers, like how many great managers have you ever had? Just
this
if you
is a
had to
really
count.
this is an important question. I would say probably 15% of the managers I had were good or
Okay.
great. And I think that's not unusual. I think the majority of managers are not great managers. Not because they're bad people, and this is like part of why I wrote both of these books, but because there's sort of there's a million problems, but I'm going to focus on two. Uh, One of them is that it's very rare that managers are taught what it means to be a manager. Like, what do managers do? Even just answering that question was very hard for when I first started Juice Software. A friend of mine came to me and said, and I was the co-founder and CEO. And a friend of mine came to me and said, "Ah, this is really hard for you because you hate the man, and now you are the man, but you're not a man." Like, it was very, very complicated. And I think a lot of people feel that way when they become managers. There's a lot of ambivalence or inner conflict about the role itself. There's not even a good word for the job that is positive. They all carry some kind of negative connotation. Um, and so I think and I went to business school. You would think you'd be taught how to manage people at business school, but there I learned exactly nothing about managing. I learned about finance, I learned about strategy, but I did not learn about managing people. And I did learn that a good two by two can solve all of life's hardest problems. And you'll notice that I apply that in both of my books. But I think that this is beginning to change. Part of the reason why I left Google and went to Apple was because Steve Jobs had decided that they were going to throw away all their management training and start from a blank piece of paper and take it more seriously this time. And I think that's something that happened not only at Apple, but has happened at a bunch of different companies. And so that's beginning to change, but it hasn't. And in fact, I'm going to teach a class on management at Harvard Business School in January. So,
Oh,
so,
amazing.
so it's beginning. I mean, I have to design that class, so it's not amazing yet, but it will be. We're working on it.
Have you had a chance to watch Coach K's masterclass? I know it's basketball and all that, but have you seen it?
No, I haven't, but I should check. I also did a
It's really
master
good.
class,
Oh,
which
you
I
did? Okay.
enjoyed thoroughly. Yeah, on radical candor. So I'll do another one on radical respect. Yeah, I really enjoy that. The team at masterclass is incredible.
They're really
I
good.
would
Yeah.
say the CEO of masterclass is a great leader.
Are they good at like making you think about it differently? And because you did a video
Yes,
about the book too, right? I saw it. I forgot what website.
lit video
Yeah,
books.
that looked
Yes,
really interesting too.
yeah,
I've only saw the trailer, but that to me it seemed like, is that like a master class? Like, what, it kind of looked like one.
yeah. It's different. I would say it's pretty different from a master class. I mean,
Okay.
at master class they really focused on breaking it down into it, they focused on teaching at Matt, as you can imagine, as opposed to just doing a talk about the book.
Okay.
And both are useful. I mean, I think a book itself is useful, but it's one of the things that I learned after Radical Candor, and I've learned it again after Radical Respect came out, is that writing a book is very different from teaching. And teaching is about taking the ideas in the book and like breaking them down into smaller pieces and getting much more prescriptive about, here's how I could do this, how could you do this, how can we do this, like it's a different skill set.
Yeah.
And masterclass is very good at they focus on teaching. Lit video books focuses on the books.
Okay.
So
It's interesting. I could tell even by the style of the book, you have like the taxonomy is almost like a guardrail of like, where am I?
yeah,
Like, oh, here I am.
yes.
Okay, I'm here. Like, yeah,
Well, so the taxonomy, which is at the and I had to really persuade the publisher to do this. They were reluctant to put it in there,
really. Okay.
but for good reasons. But I'm glad that we agreed that it made sense.
Oh,
So we went
100%.
back and
Yeah.
forth, so the taxonomy sort of breaks the problem of disrespect down into its component parts. So there's bias, prejudice, and bullying. And then when you layer power on top of bias, prejudice, and bullying, you get discrimination, harassment, and physical violations, ranging from the unwanted, sort of shoulder rub to actual sexual assault. And I noticed as I wrote the book, like my goal in the book was to break these different attitudes and behaviors down into their component parts so we can begin to solve the problem. And the problem I think is that we often conflate those behaviors as though they're the same thing, but they're very different things. And even though I thought I had broken the problem down, I noticed as I was writing that I kept talking about one thing when I was supposed to be talking about another thing. And so first I made that taxonomy for myself, like to keep myself
Ah,
oriented as I was writing the book. And then I realized it's really helpful for readers to have access to that and for me to circle what it is that we're talking about on those particular pages. So I'm glad you found that helpful.
yeah, no, definitely. And maybe I feel like we just started, like running out of time. Um, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear this story because I feel like this sort of encapsulates part of the book. You talked about Mitch and he's going into a skip level meeting with Sheryl Sandberg.
Yeah.
And I love how you kind of bring it back, right? It's sort of like it's the leader's responsibility. It's a little Jocko Willink, right? It's like it's
Yeah.
I fault everyone,
Yeah.
got hurt or
Yeah.
whatever. But like what happened there? And yeah, I think that's like a perfect way, even for me to like, because people ask me like, what is the book about? Like,
Yeah.
should I read it? But like that's the kind of story that encapsulates why you should read it.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that I did in the book was to think very to at least I think it was clear. You can tell me if I succeeded, but to try to be as clear as possible about what is our responsibility depending on our role. And if you're a leader, it's your job to try to prevent bias from getting in your team's way. And bias is inevitable, so congratulations. Your job as a leader is to prevent the inevitable. That's why you get paid the big bucks. But if you're the person who's harmed, you get to choose your response. And sometimes you're both the person who's been harmed by the bias and you're the leader at the same time. And if you're the leader, you have to, that's the role that you have to anchor on. But it is easy not to. And so I tell a story in the book about this, about being simultaneously the leader and the person harmed. So I just hired this guy, Mitch. We'll call him Mitch. That's not really his name. And Mitch referred to the women on his team as girls. And for me, this is like fingernails on a chalkboard. And for a lot of other, not for all women, but for a lot of other women, that's like fingers on a chalkboard. It's like the wrong answer on an SAT. Boy is to girl as man is to woman, you know, so don't call women girls. And this is something I've been saying to people, in particular to men who've worked for me for a long time. And this is also a conversation that I'm frankly sick and tired of having. Like, oh my God, this again? And I had just hired Mitch and I liked him. And I thought, these are the lies we tell ourselves. I told myself, well, I know I should tell him, you know, I'm the radical candor leader. I know I should tell him, but I'm going to build a better relationship with him. I don't want this to be like one of the first conversations we have in his first 2 weeks on the job. And so I kind of let it slide. And as the person, as a woman, I had a right to choose my battles. But as his leader, I did not have a right. It was my job actually to tell him, both for his sake and for the sake of the women who worked for him, who also found that to be like fingernails on a chalkboard. But it's worse coming from your boss than your employee. So anyway, I didn't say anything. And then Mitch had a meeting with my boss, who was Cheryl Sandberg. And he walked into this meeting with it's one-on-one meeting with her, and he was excited to have the meeting. She has this great reputation. And he walks into her office, he sits down and he says something about the girls on his team. And unlike me, Cheryl did not hold back. She told him exactly, and that was all they talked about really for 45 minutes. He got quite an education. And after his meeting with Cheryl, he came into my office and he was sort of pale. He was like, what, you know, why didn't you tell me? It was one of those, why didn't you tell me moments that I had as a leader. And, you know, I made it even worse because rather than apologizing, you know, acknowledging what I had done wrong and apologizing to him, there were two other guys in my office who had worked for me for a long time, including at a startup and I'd had this conversation with them several times. And in fact, they had argued with me and like, ugh. And I'd eventually persuaded them that they should call women women. And instead of apologizing to Mitch, I looked at these other two guys and I was like, you can thank me now because you didn't just get reamed out by Cheryl Sandberg. And Mitch looked at me and he was like, what about me? Like, that is so unacceptable. And Mitch had a very high bar he made me a better manager. He had a very high bar and he was going to hold me accountable for my failure as his leader. And again, to my shame, I said what people often say in this situation and what had been said to me when the shoe was on the other foot. I was like, oh, it's no big deal. Don't make such a big deal of it, you know. And Mitch, again, to his credit, he looked at me and he said, I would say that when your boss's boss yells at you for 45 minutes about a mistake that you made that your boss easily could have given you a heads up about, it is a big deal. And finally, I was like, okay, Mitch, you're right. You know, but it took he really had to hold me accountable as his leader for doing the right thing.
Yeah, I love that. You know, when I read about the like don't call women like grown women girls, I think back like my parents were in the restaurant business. They had a restaurant in Oakland and I worked there through college and
Yeah.
like me not even recognizing this. And I just remember there was this couple on the patio. They were super nice. They had dinner and whatnot. And they paid the bill and they left a note on a napkin
Mm-hmm.
in the bill that like sort of folds up
Right.
in the holder. And it said, please don't call us you guys. I
Yes.
never forgot. I was probably 19.
Yeah.
I never forgot that, like for the
Yeah.
rest of my life. And
Yeah.
so in the future, when I saw like a couple, I would use different language. I would say you like you all or you both or whatever it might be. I just had
Folks or
no
whatever.
clue.
Yeah.
But yeah, I
Yeah.
just said not say you guys. I just never like I mean that's the thing, right? If nobody tells you, how do you begin to be more aware of these things if you don't get the feedback? I think
Yeah.
that's the other challenge you
Yeah.
talk about. Maybe we should talk about like what an upstander is, because I think it's
Yes.
a cool term, and especially if you want to give feedback to your coworkers or even your boss,
Mm-hmm.
managing up the right way. Like how do we begin to do that? But what's an upstander? Like how do you
Yeah.
describe it?
Yeah. An upstander is someone who notices bias or prejudice or bullying and who intervenes in some way. And there's a lot of different ways to intervene as an upstander. And I want to say like part of the reason why I was so excited to write Radical Respect is to express gratitude for the many upstanders I've had in my career. They make a huge difference. And so I thought about, I mean, it's tempting to think that an upstander is standing up for you, and that's, I think, the wrong way to think about it. That's what takes us down the path of the knight in shining armor or white savior complex or something like that. So an upstander is one who intervenes in some way, not because you couldn't fight your own battles, but because they care about you, because they know that there's practical benefits to intervening, and because they know it's more efficient for them to intervene than it is for you to stand up for yourself. And there are a bunch of different ways to intervene as an upstander. I mean, we tend to think about, oh, I'm going to charge in and say something directly in the moment, right to the person, but that's not always safe. In fact, my husband and I were talking about this at one point. We were in an airport, and someone there was a guy uh, who was just berating this woman, a flight attendant. And my husband sort of felt like if he got in the guy's face about it, he might get punched, So it was safer for me to be the upstander than, I mean, it's not impossible that I would get punched, but less likely. And so it's not always the right thing to do it directly, although often you can say something directly. Sometimes you can delegate to someone else, as my husband did to me. He delegated. There's another thing you could do, which is just to delay
Hmm.
and check in with the person who was harmed by the disrespectful attitude or behavior after the event. So, for example, at one point in my career, I was giving a presentation to a team of 5,000 people. And the leader of that team, and I was going on stage with two colleagues, and the leader of that team introduced one of my colleagues, shook his hand, introduced my second colleague, shook his hand, introduced me, and I stuck my hand out for him to shake it. And the guy grabs it and kisses it, kind of like leaving spit on the back. It was a disgusting moment. That was bad enough. But what was even worse was that nobody checked in with me later. Of those 5,000 people, not a single person came up to me afterwards and said, "Do you want a little hand sanitizer?"
Did he think it was
Or
like a sign of
anything.
respect or something or no?
No. Oh, he
Okay.
was known. He was known to be. He was known to be skeptical of women in leadership roles. I
Okay.
think he was. It was a. I mean, I interpreted it as he was putting me in my place.
Okay. It wasn't like
Maybe.
the cultural pee in the bucket story.
Yeah. Yeah. I
It
think that was
was.
also that was also maybe putting me in my place.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
felt, but who knows what it was? I don't know whether it was just he thought he was being charming,
Okay.
or he was putting me in my place, or like some combination. And that's again, to go back to bias, prejudice, and bullying. Was it bias, or was it prejudice? Did he actually think women shouldn't work, or was he just bullying me? Was he just putting me in my place? You're not always sure. I interpreted it as a form of bullying, but I could be wrong. I mean, you don't have to be sure. But the point is, the fact that nobody came up to me later and said they found it weird in some way or shape or form, left me feeling gaslit and
Mm,
wondering, like, was I the only person who thought that was weird? Am I making too big a deal of this? So just checking in with someone later, and that's sort of what I mean by delay. And I didn't make this up, by the way. There's an organization called Right to Be, righttobee.org. You can learn more about the called the 5 Ds. So we've talked about sort of intervening directly, delegating to someone else. You can delay your response. You can also document what happened. We're all walking around with these video, you know, cameras in our pocket. But remember, if you document what happened, or you can write down what happened, but if you document it, you want to share that documentation with the person who was harmed. You don't own it, and you don't
mm,
want to, you know, they probably don't want it on social media. Or maybe they do, but they get to decide what you do with that documentation. And you can also just create a distraction. Spill your coffee. That can give the person harmed kind of a chance to
mm.
sort of not be the center of attention of this unwanted attitude or behavior. So those are some things that upstanders can do that can make a big difference in terms of creating a better work environment. And I think that there's, you know, I talked about the advantages that upstanders have. You know, it's easier often to hear about it if you're going to challenge directly. It's easier for the person to hear it from you than from the person they harmed. So it's a little bit more efficient. You care about the person, so you don't want to see them disrespected. And usually that person has something to add. And so there's a practical reason it's going to improve performance of the team. But there's also kind of a self-interested aspect to being an upstander, because if you're a silent bystander, at least I find often when I don't say something and I feel like I should have, it's the kind of thing that wakes me up in the middle of the night and I'm
Mm.
filled with regret. There's kind of a moral injury to you if you remain silent as a bystander. And I learned this from my son who was witnessing a kid getting bullied, and the kid was getting bullied by the teacher actually, and so he felt silenced. He didn't know what to do, and this is when he was in, I don't know, I think it was during COVID, and and so he didn't do anything, and then he was very sad about having, and he felt bad about him, you know, and he came and talked to me about it, and I realized that that's a real thing.
He was
And
watching another kid get bullied.
get bullied by a teacher, and he's like, do I, you know, do I, am I the one who's gonna, and that was kind of what prompted me to look up this right to be. And I said, maybe it wasn't the best for that kid, or maybe it wasn't safe for you to intervene directly in the moment with the teacher, but you can call that kid after and see if they're okay. Like, that's, there are a
Mm.
lot of things you can do that don't involve sort of escalating an already tense situation.
That makes sense. I mean, I think the big takeaway is you can be part of the solution, even if you're not
Yeah.
the people leader or the CEO of a company
Yeah.
or the head of
Or the,
HR.
or yeah, or the person who's going to take the risk of, you know, there may be real risks to you. Like
One of
I didn't want
yeah,
my husband to get punched in the face and on the airplane, you know.
I've seen videos, yeah, of
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the Mike Tyson video. Um, One of the things that you talk about, I thought was just an interesting concept. Is it you call it, or maybe Jennifer Freyd, the psychologist, calls
Yes.
it institutional courage, and
Yes.
kind of the meaning is a commitment from leadership to seek the truth. And you bring this up because in order for radical respect to kind of take place, you really need to instill this and sort of, I guess what you say, foster a culture of respect. So I'm just wondering from the idea of institutional courage, like how should leaders think about that? Like really kind of seeking out the truth. Is it something that you think like is easy to start that process, or is it maybe too much to kind of can it be overwhelming for them?
Yes, it is. It's easy to start, and yes, it's overwhelming. Both of those things I think are true. And it's not what your lawyers will suggest that you do often, or even your HR team. Very often we're counseled not to be aware of things that are going wrong in our organizations. And I think that's terrible advice because you're never going to fix the problem. And I think that advice is beginning to change, especially with sort of human capital management requirements that
Mm,
are increasingly part of how companies are assessed. But you want to be aware of things going wrong at your in your culture in your company. You want to be aware of disrespectful attitudes and behaviors so that you can change them. And yet so often it's our instinct to deny, and so we want to be gentle with ourselves. I mean, that is a normal human instinct if you realize you've hurt someone else, or your institution has harmed someone that works there, now you're the culprit, and it's very hard. That role is often at least for me, that's the least comfortable of all the roles, is when I realize I've done or said the bad thing. And often we feel ashamed when we realize that, and often a response to shame is to become unaware of it. I mean, what did
mm.
Oedipus do when he realized he had murdered he gouged his eyes out? Like, so don't do that. Don't gouge your eyes out.
But you've
um
got to be committed to this sort of
yeah, you've got to be.
idea of seeking the truth, or else like none of
Yes.
this really works, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And realizing that it is your job to be aware as a leader. Like that is the essence of leadership. Being unaware of something bad that's happening. I mean, imagine if someone if some CEO was told by a stock analyst, you're not profitable. And the CEO's response was, I wasn't aware. Like,
Yeah.
it's ridiculous. It's the same thing with bad behavior going on in your
Yeah.
team. Like, I wasn't aware is not an acceptable response. So you need to be aware. And this actually comes from one of the things that I have found helpful is this acronym that I developed based on the work of Maimonides, as reported in Danya Ruttenberg's wonderful book on repentance and repair. And I think this can help us. This When I realize I've said or done something that has harmed someone, or my organization as a leader has done something that has harmed someone, uh, my instinct is, oh, I don't want to know, and so to overcome that instinct, I try to say, act. And the first A in act, there's 5 A's. The first A is to be aware of what's going on. The
Mm,
second A is to sort of share what happened, to admit the wrongdoing openly, not to try to cover it up, which is often what the kind of advice that like there's all these BS investigations that happen, and really they're about covering it up, not uncovering it. so
right.
so you want to acknowledge, so you want to be aware, and then you want to acknowledge what you did wrong. Then you want to accept the consequences. Like, don't, maybe you're going to have to pay this person something. Okay, pay, there are legal requirements. Accept those. Don't try to fight those. And maybe even make amends. Maybe even go beyond what is required legally to make things right. And only after you've done those things do you get to apologize to the
Mm.
person. And then you've got to change. You've got to figure out, like, what is it in our management systems and the way that we operate that allowed this thing to happen, and how can we change those systems so that we can prevent it from happening next time.
A slight pivot. I don't want to miss this. Audre Lorde, if I'm saying her
Yes.
name right.
Yes,
I feel like
Audra.
she Audra. Okay, my daughter's name is Audrey, by the way.
Okay.
But after Audrey Hepburn, though. But like it seems like she influences your work quite a bit. So
Yes.
I go down rabbit holes, and I'm like, who is this person? And I start researching her. But I'm curious, like, what impact did she have on your work?
So when I started writing this book, I didn't even know who Audre Lorde was, in fact. And someone said, you must read Audre Lorde. And so this was one of the really important things, I think, for me at least, in writing this book, was to make sure that I wasn't so limited by my own lived experiences that I wasn't noticing what was happening since, since it was that story that I told you that about the woman who when she was implementing radical candor was unjustly accused of being angry when she wasn't angry. I think that I think that it was really important to me to read different people's perspectives. And Audre Lorde had an enormous impact. And part of what she said, I want to read this actually because I don't want to
Yeah.
mess up her words. It's so beautiful. This sums up the whole purpose of radical respect. She says, difference must be not merely tolerated, but seen as a fund of necessary polarities between which our creativity can spark. Only then does the necessity for interdependency become unthreatening. And that's it, isn't it? Like it's so
Yeah.
beautifully put. And not only unthreatening, but fun. Like it's fun to work with people who are going to help us notice whole aspects of life that we were unaware of. And that really is where innovation and creativity come from, are these differences. And that's how we honor everyone's individuality. I mean, there's nothing fun about working in a authoritarian, everybody's marching in lockstep kind of 1984 style. Everybody has to wear the same clothes and look the same. That's not fun.
Yeah. I mean, you say like there's a lot of themes in there. Like the best teams give everyone a voice. Like there's
Yes.
so many things. I feel like even the teams that think they're doing these things right, they probably have room to improve.
Oh, certainly. I mean, I certainly don't pretend like I'm getting it right all the time. I'm getting it wrong all the time, in fact. And the more open I am to hearing about that, the as my son's baseball coach said, you can't do right if you don't know what you're doing wrong. and
Yeah,
uh
100%.
and we got to be open to hearing about it. But we're in this moment where we're not really as open as we could be to hearing about it.
Do you feel like we do a good job? I know there's like books on these topics, but like learning from the failures versus learning from the wins and sort of like thinking like I'm sure you would agree you've learned more from the failures, but do you feel like we do a good job of reflecting on that?
Well, I mean, I actually, so success is a great deodorant. I want to acknowledge that. But I think I think it's hard to learn from our failures, but I do think we actually do a decent job of learning from our failures. I think one of the biggest mistakes that I made in writing this book is that it's so we because we learn from failure, we tend to have a negativity bias, and we tend to focus on the failure too much. And one of the people who worked for me at Google was a fighter pilot, and he would talk about positive target identification. And he said, if you're flying a plane through dangerous territory, like through a mountain range, you want to look at the pass through the range. You don't want to look at the mountain that you're afraid of hitting. Because if you spend too much time focused on the problems, you actually are more likely to have those problems. And so I think we don't, and that's why I told the story when we started talking about this experience I had when I first joined Google, where I was paid fairly, and there was, not diversity was certainly not perfect, but there was a more diverse set of leaders above me than I'd had at other companies. Um, and people were respectful of one another, and delighted in each other's quirks instead of trying to sand them away. And I think it's really important to have a little positive target identification in this moment. In fact, the book that I'm working on now is a utopian novel in which I imagine a world in which we've some of these problems that seem intractable, we've made some progress against, because optimism is really important. And I think right now, you know, I don't know. It seems like the world is kind of a bummer, and I think there's what to be optimistic about. I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish, but I
Right.
think
Yeah.
Dua Lipe just said she's all about radical optimism, and I love that. So, yes, I'm embracing her radical optimism.
I love the quote too. I feel like it also sums up a lot of the book that good communication gets measured not by the speaker's mouth, but by the listener's ear.
Yes. Yeah.
That was a
And I
good
think
one.
it's, with all this emphasis on authenticity, which is great, but authenticity does not mean ignoring the impact you're having on others. And sometimes someone will say something that's incredibly offensive and they're like, "Oh, that's just who I am." And I'm like, "No, you're more than that offensive thing you just said." And you could say it differently. And if you want to communicate with that person, you should learn to say it differently.
Um, I can go on for another 30 minutes, but before we wrap, I'd love to know, are there a couple of books that have made a big impact on you, business or novels that you recommend other people read?
Yes, I think that reading novels is the thing that we can do to be better colleagues, to build our capacity for compassion and empathy for others more than just about anything else that we could do. So I'm gonna tell you a couple of books that I just read that I loved, but and then I'll tell you like my all-time
Do
favorites.
you have a list? Is that a list of
I
a
well,
memo?
no, I'm just
Yeah.
pulling up I listen to books. My
Oh,
children say,
cool.
"You don't read, Mom. You listen to them."
That's awesome.
So I'm pulling up a
Okay.
couple that I just read. Master Slave Husband Wife by Ilian Wu is just a remarkable. It just won the Pulitzer Prize.
Oh,
And my
wow.
friend Don Davis helped edit it. So it is really interesting. Another book that I just read, this is not a novel, but it is really interesting, is A Brief History of Intelligence by
Oh,
Max Bennett. It is both of these books are just fantastic. Best novels of all time. I Toni Morrison, I was lucky enough to take a class from her when I was in college. And Song of Solomon, I think, is one of the great novels in the English language. I love that. I
was
love
she
that
like an
novel.
author essentially?
Toni
Tony?
Morrison is a novelist.
Okay.
Yes, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. She died recently, but she also wrote a book called The Bluest Eye. I mean, she's written so many great novels. Read all of Toni Morrison's novels,
Okay.
each and every one of them. And another one of my favorites is Middlemarch by George Eliot. I think that is really a brilliant novel.
What about like, I mean, you're a pretty good writer. Is that natural to you, or is there a book that you've read that's, or I'm sure you have like a coach, or what's been
Oh,
an
on
impact?
writing, what's helped me writing? I did have a coach. She wrote a book called "So You Want to Write a Novel?"
Oh,
And
really? Okay,
yes,
interesting. Isn't it
uh,
funny? Like the best, like the people who write books on writing always have like the best titles.
yeah, of course they better. I also love Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. Is just one of the great books of all time. Not just about writing, but about life and about breaking problems. Actually, I thought
I
a
need to
lot
read that.
about Bird
Okay.
by Bird as I was writing Radical Respect because I was like breaking the problem down. The title of that book, Bird by Bird, comes from her watching her brother had to write a book report on birds, and he was overwhelmed by the huge number of by birds, and he went to his father and he said, "How am I going to get this report written?" And he said, "Bird by bird, buddy, bird by
That's
bird."
funny.
And that, I think that's really true of life. Like, let's sometimes it's problems seem like they're monolithic, and if we can break them down, then we can approach them. So those are a couple of great books on writing. There's a lot. There's a lot of great books on writing actually, but those are two that come to mind.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I haven't read all of them, but I sort of collect a stack. I feel like it's something that like you can never get too good at, and if you read a little bit at a time, you can implement it.
Yeah.
Um, Someone recommended like writing down the bones, and it's one of those I can read like 5 pages at a
Yes.
time,
Yeah. Yeah.
digest it, read another
Yeah.
few pages, that sort of thing.
Yeah. There's also John Gunther wrote a book on writing well. Um, and George Saunders actually teaches a class on writing that is George Saunders wrote so many great books, but A Swim in a Pond in the Rain is one that I recently read, which is sort of an analysis of several Russian short stories. It's
Okay.
one of my favorite books that I've read recently. And he has written a lot about writing and teaches about writing, and he's great. He's a treasure.
Interesting. Okay. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you just leaning into this. It's been a lot of fun. Do you
Well,
feel like we?
thank you. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
And thank you for writing. Writing is a labor of love for which none of us are well enough compensated. So,
It's like leg day at the gym. I always call it.
yes, yes, it
I hate
is.
doing it, but I always, I feel like I learn a little bit about myself. And I always try to keep it somewhat biographical in a sense. So if I'll interview somebody with their
Yeah.
book, I always try to make it personal. And I feel like those are the stories. Like the more I can kind of write for myself, the more I think the output is more interesting and helpful to other people.
Yeah, I have two additional thoughts about that. One is there's in we're never going to stop talking.
I'm good. The
I
kids
think
have not knocked on the door,
they
so we're
haven't
good.
knocked
Yeah,
on the
not
door. All
yet.
right, you're good. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm missing, but whatever it is, this is more fun. Um, in Moby Dick, there's this scene where Pip falls overboard, and Pip's and the boat sails off. They come back and they get Pip, but it says his horizons expanded endlessly around him, and he goes down to the bottom of the ocean and somehow comes back up. And the description of this is about like going down to the depths and bringing something from the depth, from the bottom of the ocean, back up to the surface. And for me, that's a metaphor of writing. I sort of feel
Yeah.
like that's what Melville was doing for us, is he was like going deep in his consciousness, subconsciousness, and bringing some kind of treasure up. Uh, I always feel like the second hardest thing about writing is getting inside my own head, but the hardest thing is getting back out, and that's where I need editors and other people who read, and readers also, people who just read. The other thing I will say about and this is deep gratitude to my friend Michael Schrage, who, when I started writing Radical Candor, there was, I'm in Silicon Valley and people are like, oh, where's your data? And I'm like, oh, do I have to do research? I'm just trying to make sense of my own experience, as my own personal experience as a manager. And Michael Schrage sent me this book by James March called The Ambiguities of Experience. And he talks about there's four different paths to wisdom, and one of them is collecting data, but another
Mhm.
one is going deep into your own soul and figuring out what's making sense of your own experience. And he says both of these are legitimate ways to seek truth. And that like kind of liberated me. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm doing the make sense of my own experience
Yeah.
sort of thing. I'm not doing the I'm trying to research thing.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. I appreciate it. I think it's my job not to screw this up from here. So look forward to putting this together. If
All
you think of
right.
anything else, just let me know.
Great. And yeah, and let me know if you want once it's out, if you want us to give social media love, send it to me. I miss a lot of emails. All
Great.
right. Be
All
well.
right.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye.